It's the economy, stupid. Yes, that's the issue, I think, that will dominate domestic politics for the next couple of years and probably the general election itself. And I say that on the day when inflation goes up by a further 2%. The CPI is now at 9%. Interestingly, the retail price index, which is how we used to measure inflation, is showing 11%. And the last time it was there, well, let's say back in the early 1980s, interest rates were 13%. Today, they're 1%, which gives you a clue the direction in which they're going to go. I have been pretty critical for the last few weeks actually, of the governor of the Bank of England, Andrew out to lunch Bailey, who's been asleep at the wheel. But it's not just him. Number 10, the government have gravely underestimated what was happening, the inflationary cycle that was beginning within the UK economy. And by the way, this is all way before the invasion of Ukraine and the price shocks we've seen in some of those commodities. Let's just take a look at Boris Johnson in October last year being asked on Sky News whether he thought inflation was a threat.
Are you worried about inflation? And I'm very encouraged.
Are you worried about inflation?
I'm very encouraged by the growth that I'm seeing.
I understand you, but are you worried about inflation?
Well, people have been worrying about inflation for a very long time. I'm looking at robust economic growth, and by the way, those fears have been unfounded.
Well, these fears have been unfounded. He made it perfectly clear that was as recently as October. So the establishment got this completely and utterly wrong way before the invasion of Ukraine. And now the government is in some trouble on this issue. You see, traditionally, we always think of a Conservative Party as being the one that wants to cut taxes, not wanting to put them up. We tend to think of the Conservative Party as running much smaller budget deficits than the Labour Party, but since 2010 they've grown hugely. And on the general economic theme, here was Boris Johnson in the Commons today.
This government is not in principle in favour of higher taxation. Of course not. But what we want to do, we don't want to put. Of course they love it. They love it, Mr. Speaker. They love putting up taxes. All this was. Don't spot. Labour meow. Labour puts up taxes. Cats meow. Labour put up taxes. What we want to do. What we want to do is take a sensible approach governed by the impact on investment and jobs, Mr. Speaker. And that is the test of a strong economy.
Well, you can see they are in some trouble. It's all well and good talking about jobs, but we're basically at full employment. Highest employment levels we've had for 50 years, and there are basically quite severe shortages in many parts of the economy. But here's the question. We need to have a robust debate about where we go from here, not just look back and say they've made a mess of it. And that's where, in a functioning democracy, opposition comes in. Do Labour have the answers? Let me know what you think. Farage at GBNews.uk. I really don't think they do. And one little piece of news. I spoke just before the show to a reputable private pollster who tells me that Keir Starmer's personal ratings have fallen about 15% over the course of the last month. Much of that nothing to do with economics, but to do with the fact that if you put yourself up as the paragon of model virtue and behaviour and then get dragged into difficulties over Beergate, people don't like it. So do Labour have the answers? Well, they've got one really big policy, and that is putting big taxes on the oil and gas companies. That appears short-term to have support in the opinion polls. Who knows? Maybe the Conservatives will follow it. Well, joining me is a man who's been around economics and crises over many years, Jonathan Portes, who of course was the chief economist to the cabinet from 2008 to 11, and currently you're Professor of Economics and Public Policy at King's College London. As I say, I've been accusing the governor of being asleep at the wheel and the government too, underestimating what was coming. Do you agree with me that the inflationary signs were there before the invasion of Ukraine?
Yes, absolutely. Oil and energy prices had already gone up, and that's most of what we're seeing now. food prices were already going up, in part because of Brexit, as some research has recently shown.
We'll argue that another night.
I'm afraid it's there in the numbers.
I mean, surely what we could do is reduce tariffs on food we import from all over the world, but we haven't done it.
We could, and that's actually a pretty good idea. It won't make much difference, I'm afraid, because tariffs are basically, they're just not that high. And of course, the reason food prices have gone up is because we import a lot of food from the EU, and we don't charge tariffs on food from the EU, but there are new custom checks, there's a lot of new paperwork. Somebody's got to pay for that, and it's you and me and everybody else.
I agree it was a rotten deal. We could have done better. Anyway.
But you're right.
They missed this.
So Ukraine has obviously made matters worse.
Yep.
But you're quite right. This was coming along. I think, in fairness, we do have to step back, and regardless of what I said about Brexit, most of this inflation is a global phenomenon. Mm-hmm. And when oil and energy prices go up, we in Britain, because we're a net importer of energy, we become poorer on average.
Yes, I mean we should not be a net importer of energy, and that's another separate debate, which I feel very strongly about.
But for the moment, it makes us poorer, and so a lot of this debate is not about are we going to be poorer? We are going to be poorer. It's how you share the pain. And I thought your point about inflation being 9%, that's correct, but the Institute of Fiscal Studies produced some very interesting analysis today showing that if you're in the poorest part of the population, your inflation rate is much closer to 11%, whereas if you're in the richest part, it's much closer to 7 or 8%.
Because a higher proportion of your expenditure is, as to what you earn, is energy and food. No, and I completely understand that. But there's also the point, isn't there, that if you massively increase the money supply, if you massively increase the amount of money that's there in the economy, which you do through borrowing, and government, of course, has been playing all sorts of tricks ever since 2008 and hugely increasing it, that actually there's more money chasing the same number of goods and services.
That's true up to a point. It's hard to see that in the data. Remember, as I say, this inflation is global. Some countries have done more, have had higher
money
or lower
money creation in America, etc., has been similar, hasn't it? Or even higher.
If you look at inflation, Switzerland actually, for example, has done quite a lot of QE. Inflation rate's quite low for reasons no one quite understands. No. But it's not clear that that inflation is primarily explained by money. This bout of inflation, at least, is primarily a supply shock. What happens from here is much more down to central banks. Well,
look, economics is an art, not a science, and we know that, and that's always been the case. But what's interesting is, I made the point in my introduction that we did a robust debate about where we go from here, given just how horribly many of those on fixed incomes, pensioners, low incomes, benefits. I mean, if you're on benefits, your benefits have risen by 3.1%.
Absolutely.
And we have inflation nigh on double digits. Do Labour have the answers? Now, this big policy that they're pushing, which is let's tax the oil and gas companies and give people a rebate on their bills. Do the sums add up on that?
Well, the sums add up, but not to the big policy that you want. And you describe it as a big policy. It's not.
Well, it's
at best, it's a medium-sized policy. So if you look at the figures, it looks like they might raise about £2 billion from that.
That won't go very far.
No, it won't go very far. Remember, Sunak's package back in December was worth about £9 billion. It's generally agreed by you and by, I think, pretty much everyone else as being wholly inadequate. So to do the sorts of things that you're talking about, to restore those cuts to benefits and pensions, to make sure that nurses and teachers get at least a decent salary increase, not a huge pay cut, you're looking at a package that's got to be between 5 and 15 billion. So is Labour's windfall tax going to pay for that? No, it's not.
No.
Sure, no.
What else do Labour have to offer? I can't quite work it out.
Well, I think I'm not here.
I know that.
But no, I agree. I don't think that Labour's response is equal to the scale of the challenge here either. I think on that you're right. I mean, one thing I would note in terms of where we are all going to be poorer. A lot of this is about how you share the pain. The very interesting thing about the labour market statistics yesterday was pay is actually going up quite a lot on average. Maybe in nominal terms by its highest in a very long time. But where is it going up fastest? Bankers' bonuses.
And the highest earners.
And frankly, we were talking before about who does well out of these crises, economists. And it's true, people like me, economists, lawyers, tax lawyers, accountants, consultants, we're actually, it has to be said, doing quite well. So if you want to find the money, that's where I would start.
Yes, I'm sure that's right. And Johnson today is saying that in principle the Conservatives are a low-tax party and Labour always put taxes up. I mean, what are Labour saying on taxes? I mean, are they saying that if they get into government they'll keep taxes more or less where they are? Again, it's not a clear message I'm getting.
I don't think there is a clear message, and I think, to be fair, who knows what the position of the economy will be at the time of the next election, and I don't think it's sensible for any party to say, well, in 2025 we will plan to put up this rate of tax by 1% or this rate of tax.
No.
But I think you can send a direction of travel. So if you were asking what would I, putting a progressive agenda, want to say, I'd say, look, we should be taxing income and some forms of consumption in this country much less. We should be taxing wealth and property much more, because that's really where the money is.
Well,
under-tax wealth.
Labour may do that, but of course...
They haven't done it yet.
But of course, Tony Blair did the opposite to that and won a big majority by kind of reassuring middle-class, above-average income earners that actually he wasn't going to put taxes up. I mean, I don't know. Maybe you're right. Maybe that's the way Labour will go. A final thought, Jonathan, if I may. The most difficult question of all, of course. Where does inflation go from here?
I think that, of course, I don't know what's going to happen in Ukraine, but beyond that, assuming that Ukraine becomes some sort of stalemate, I think inflation will fall back pretty rapidly. In terms of prices actually rising in the second half of this year, of course, it'll still show up in the headline figures because we measure those a year in arrears, as it were. Yeah. But in terms of will prices be rising in the second half of the year, I don't think so. Remember, and you mentioned my term at the Cabinet Office back in 2008, 2011. Oil prices went to something like $130-something a barrel in the summer of 2008. By winter of 2008, early 2009, they'd fallen by about 2/3. So what happens if you have actually a big run-up in oil prices, rise in interest rates, a nasty recession? Actually, energy prices fall quite quickly. So I don't want to make predictions.
No.
It's not impossible that a year from now our big problem might not be inflation anymore. It might be growth in employment.
Jonathan Borders, thank you very much. And I have to say, as a former commodities trader, predicting these things is incredibly difficult, which is why I always like to put the other chap on the spot.